A millionaire pays a homeless woman to have a baby, but when the child is born, he is shocked by what he sees. David Lewis stood at the pinnacle of success, a man whose name commanded respect and admiration wherever he went. At 42, he had amassed wealth beyond measure, owning sprawling estates, luxurious cars, and a portfolio of thriving businesses. His life was a showcase of achievement. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay an emptiness he could no longer ignore. For years, David had been consumed by the pursuit of power and influence, convinced that material success would bring him fulfillment. He had married twice, each time to women who seemed perfect on paper, but both relationships crumbled under the weight of his emotional detachment and their expectations of love. David viewed love as a distraction, an illusion that clouded judgment and led to disappointment. As he sat alone in his opulent penthouse, surrounded by silence, he grappled with a painful truth: his legacy would end with him. There would be no one to carry his name or inherit the empire he had meticulously built. An heir could change that. A child could be molded to preserve and expand the Lewis legacy. However, David wanted no emotional ties or family dynamics to complicate matters. For him, this wasn't about family, it was about securing an investment and ensuring his narrative continued. He envisioned a transaction free of emotional entanglements, where all roles were clear, like a contract in the boardroom. Determined to act, he resolved to find someone willing to fulfill his terms. Little did he know, this decision would challenge everything he thought he knew about control, connection, and legacy. As he drove through the city streets in his sports car, David's mind was preoccupied with the details of his plan. He needed someone willing, capable, and desperate enough to agree to the arrangement without question. At an intersection, he noticed a woman on the sidewalk. She sat hunched over a scrap of paper, sketching with intense focus, oblivious to the chaos around her. Her clothes were worn, her frame thin, but her determination was striking. David's instincts rarely failed him, and something about her resilience drew him in. He turned his car around and returned to the intersection. She was still there, her movements confident despite her circumstances. Rolling down his window, he called out, "Hey, you." Her blue eyes, filled with suspicion and curiosity, met his. Thus began a journey that would reshape his understanding of legacy, connection, and purpose. At the bottom of the page, the act felt both empowering and terrifying, a leap into an unknown future. As she set the pen down, David extended a hand across the table. "To a successful partnership," he said, his voice cool but sincere. Susan hesitated, then shook his hand. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that this strange, unorthodox arrangement might be her chance to reclaim her life. But as she left the office that day, clutching her copy of the contract, she couldn't shake the feeling that this deal was only the beginning and that the road ahead would be far more complicated than either of them anticipated. The arrangement was simple on paper, but life rarely adheres to simplicity. As weeks turned into months, Susan and David found themselves navigating a tenuous partnership, each confronting unexpected challenges that blurred the lines of their strictly professional agreement. Susan moved into the townhouse David had arranged for her, a space that felt both luxurious and isolating. The rooms were impeccably furnished, the refrigerator stocked with gourmet meals, and the closets filled with clothes that fit her for the first time in years. Yet, the silence of her new life was deafening. For someone who had lived amidst the cacophony of city streets, the absence of sound was unnerving. To fill the void, Susan turned to her art. She covered the walls of the spare room with sketches, portraits of strangers she remembered from the streets, abstract shapes that reflected her tangled emotions, and even the beginnings of a mural that captured the faint hope stirring within her. It was her way of reclaiming her identity, reminding herself that she was more than a vessel for someone else's future. David, meanwhile, kept his distance, fulfilling his end of the deal with precision. He visited occasionally, accompanied by doctors or lawyers, ensuring that every aspect of the arrangement was proceeding as planned. His questions were clinical: "How are you feeling? Is the baby developing well? His demeanor remained detached, but during one of these visits, something shifted. David arrived unexpectedly, unaccompanied, and found Susan in the spare room, her hands smudged with charcoal as she added details to her mural. She barely noticed him at first, engrossed in her work. When she finally looked up, she caught him staring at the wall, his expression unreadable. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Susan hesitated, then shrugged. "Just something to keep me sane." David stepped closer, his eyes scanning the intricate details. "It's impressive," he admitted after a moment. "I didn't know you were an artist." Susan smirked faintly. "There's a lot you don't know about me." That remark lingered in the air, heavier than either of them expected. For the first time, David felt a twinge of curiosity about the woman he had chosen for this arrangement. She wasn't just a means to an end, she was a person with depth and talent that he hadn't bothered to acknowledge. As the pregnancy progressed, their interactions grew less formal. Susan, never one to hold back, began to challenge David in ways he wasn't accustomed to. During their conversations, she would poke at his calculated worldview, questioning his motives and the choices that had led him to this moment. "You're so obsessed with control," she said one evening, her hands resting on her growing belly. "Have you ever thought about what happens when things don't go according to plan?" David frowned, his gaze narrowing. "That's why I plan meticulously, to avoid surprises." Susan laughed softly, shaking her head. "Life doesn't care about your plans, David. Look at me. Do you think I plan to end up homeless? To be sitting here doing this?" Her words struck a nerve, though David didn't show it. For all his success, he knew she was right. Life had thrown him curveballs too, failed marriages and the loneliness he refused to admit to himself. But unlike Susan, he had always responded by tightening his grip on control. Their bond began to deepen in subtle ways. David started visiting more frequently, sometimes staying longer than necessary. He brought books about parenting and child development, which Susan read voraciously, much to his surprise. She teased him about his dry choices, recommending novels and art books in return. Once, on a rare evening when they both lingered in the living room, Susan played an old guitar she had salvaged from a thrift store. The melody was simple but heartfelt, and for the first time, David felt a warmth that had eluded him for years. He didn't say anything, but Susan noticed the way he lingered by the door before leaving, as if reluctant to go. One day, during a routine checkup, the doctor mentioned the baby's strong heartbeat. David, who had always viewed the pregnancy in abstract terms, felt a flicker of emotion he couldn't quite name. Later, as they left the clinic, Susan handed him a small sketch she had made, a simple drawing of what she imagined the baby might look like. "Just thought you'd like to see," she said casually, but there was a softness in her voice that caught him off guard. David stared at the sketch for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. That night, he placed it on his desk beside the framed photographs of his corporate achievements. By the time Susan entered her third trimester, the walls they had both carefully built began to crack. David started asking about her art, her life before the streets, and what had driven her to keep going despite everything. Susan, in turn, saw glimpses of the man behind the calculated exterior, a man who, beneath his stoicism, longed for connection but was terrified of vulnerability. Their relationship remained complicated, rooted in the transaction that had brought them together. Yet moments of genuine connection, whether through shared laughter, quiet conversations, or unspoken understanding, began to redefine the terms of their partnership. Susan's resilience, her ability to find beauty in chaos, challenged David in ways he hadn't expected. And as the due date approached, he found himself wondering if this child, this arrangement, might represent more than just a continuation of his legacy. It might be a chance to rewrite his own story, discovering the meaning of trust and connection that he had spent his life avoiding. David Lewis had never imagined that someone like Susan would change him. When he first met her, she had seemed like a means to an end, another calculated choice in his meticulously planned life. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Susan's presence began to unsettle the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. It was a late evening when David found himself lingering at the townhouse longer than usual. Susan was sitting on the couch, her feet propped up on a cushion, her hands resting on her round belly. The air smelled faintly of coffee and charcoal, a mix of her nights spent sketching and her newfound love for decaf brews. "Do you ever regret this?" David asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Susan looked up, her brow furrowing. "I could, but where's the fun in that?" For the first time, David realized how much he admired her independence. Despite everything she had been through, Susan refused to let the world define her. Her strength was quiet but undeniable, and it began to inspire something in him that felt dangerously close to respect. Their bond deepened further during a particularly challenging day. Susan had experienced a scare, a sharp pain that sent her to the hospital for observation. David had arrived in a panic, his usual composure shattered as he demanded updates from the medical staff. When he finally saw Susan resting in the hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes calm, he felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. Susan smiled faintly. "I'm fine. The baby's fine. They said it's just normal stuff." David sank into the chair beside her bed, his shoulders slumping with relief. "Don't scare me like that," he muttered. Susan raised an eyebrow, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Scare you? I didn't think you were the type to get scared." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "I didn't either." The incident marked a turning point. From that day on, David began to open up in ways he never had before. He shared stories of his childhood and the pressure to succeed that had shaped him into the man he was. Susan listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights that left him questioning his long-held beliefs. "You're so focused on legacy," she said one evening as they sat on the porch. "But what's the point if you never let anyone in to share it with?" Her words lingered in David's mind long after she had gone to bed. For years, he had convinced himself that love and emotional ties were weaknesses, distractions that would only hinder his ambitions. But Susan's presence was teaching him otherwise. Her courage in the face of adversity and her unwavering determination to create beauty even in the darkest circumstances reshaped his understanding of what true strength meant. One night, as Susan worked on a painting in the spare room, David stood in the doorway watching her. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated her face, highlighting the serenity and focus in her expression. He realized with a pang of clarity that she had become more than just the woman carrying his child. She was someone he respected, someone he trusted, and perhaps someone he needed. "Thank you," he said quietly, drawing her attention. She turned her eyes to meet his. "For what?" "For reminding me that life is more than just what we leave behind." Susan smiled, her expression warm and understanding. "It's never too late to figure that out, David." For the first time in years, David felt a glimmer of hope, not just for his legacy, but for himself. Susan had become an unexpected source of light in his meticulously controlled world, and he found himself wondering what their future might hold, not as business partners, but as two people who had begun to truly see each other. The early morning air was thick with tension as David paced the hospital corridor, his polished shoes clicking against the sterile tiles. Despite his composed exterior, his mind raced with emotions he couldn't quite name. Anticipation, fear, and hope swirled together, leaving him unsettled in a way he hadn't felt in years. Inside the delivery room, Susan was enduring the final stages of labor. Her cries of effort and the murmurs of the medical staff seeped through the closed doors. For the first time, David felt utterly powerless. He had built an empire, commanded respect in every room he entered, and yet here he was, at the mercy of forces he couldn't control. When a nurse finally emerged and motioned for him to enter, David's heart pounded in his chest. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the hum of monitors providing a steady rhythm in the background. Susan lay back on the bed, her face flushed and glistening with sweat, but her expression was one of quiet triumph. In her arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was the child who had been the catalyst for this entire journey. David hesitated in the doorway, the sight before him both overwhelming and surreal. Susan looked up and caught his gaze, a faint smile curving her lips. "Come on," she said, her voice hoarse but warm. "Meet your son." The word struck David like a thunderbolt, grounding him in a reality he had scarcely allowed himself to imagine. Slowly, he approached the bed, his footsteps uncharacteristically tentative. Susan shifted slightly, offering him a clearer view of the baby. The child was small, his face red and scrunched as he squirmed lightly in the blanket. Tiny fingers peeked out, grasping at the air. David stared transfixed. This was his heir, his blood, his legacy. But as he looked closer, something deeper stirred within him, a connection he hadn't anticipated, a surge of protectiveness and wonder that left him breathless. "He's perfect," Susan murmured, her gaze soft as she watched David. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he felt an unfamiliar sting in his eyes. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Susan nodded, carefully transferring the baby into David's arms. The weight of the tiny life was both delicate and profound. As David held his son for the first time, a crack formed in the walls he had spent a lifetime building. Hours passed in a blur as David remained by Susan's side, the baby resting in a bassinet nearby. The medical staff came and went, offering congratulations and ensuring Susan's comfort. For once, David barely noticed them, his attention was entirely consumed by the child. As the baby slept, David turned to Susan, his expression uncharacteristically open. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Tired," she admitted with a small laugh, "but good. Really good." David nodded, his gaze drifting back to the bassinet. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Susan smiled faintly. "You've said that before." "This time I mean it more," he replied earnestly. "I thought this was just about a legacy, about ensuring what I've built didn't die with me. But now it feels like something more." Susan studied him, her blue eyes searching his face. "That's what happens when you let yourself feel, David. It's messy, but it's worth it." In the days that followed, David found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew. Holding his son, watching Susan interact with the baby, and reflecting on the journey they had shared forced him to confront truths he had long avoided. His son wasn't just an extension of his empire or a means of securing his name, he was a person, a tiny, vulnerable life filled with limitless potential. And Susan wasn't merely the woman who had carried his child, she was someone who had shown him resilience, kindness, and the importance of connection. One evening, as he stood by the nursery window in the townhouse cradling his son, David realized that his priorities had shifted. The cold calculations that had once defined his decisions no longer felt sufficient. His focus had shifted from building an empire to cherishing fleeting moments with his son and finding deeper connections with those he loved. The path that had once seemed clear and singular in purpose now felt uncertain, but in a strangely liberating way. David watched the baby sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This child, his son, wasn't just a continuation of his legacy, he was a new beginning, a new chapter. And it was one that David was eager to write, not with ambition alone, but with love, understanding, and vulnerability. The years spent focusing solely on his career and building a reputation paled in comparison to the magnitude of what he had now, a family, a purpose beyond his professional identity. He had come to realize that true strength wasn't just in success or legacy, it was in the connections we make, the people we hold close, and the love we give and receive. As David stood in that quiet nursery holding his son, a soft smile crossed his face. The man he had once been, driven, relentless, focused only on his achievements, had transformed. Though the future remained uncertain, he now knew he was ready to face it with a different mindset, one where legacy would no longer be the only thing driving him, but the love he had for his family, the joy in small moments, and the hope for a better, more connected world. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe for more.